Homelander's first strike should have ended it. He came down from the sky like a missile and drove a man in a bright green suit straight through the side of a brick apartment building. The impact tore open 3 floors, showering the street with concrete, glass, and people who had been standing too close to their windows. Dust swallowed the block while car alarms screamed in every direction. The man in green slid down the exposed wall like wet paint, then peeled himself off and snapped back into shape without a bruise. He looked around at the destruction as if it were mildly inconvenient, reached into thin air, and pulled out a giant wooden mallet that hadn't existed a second earlier. Homelander hit him again, harder. This time, the building didn't stop collapsing. Sirens drowned under falling debris, and cameras kept rolling as the man in green dropped an anvil from nowhere and buried Homelander under cartoon iron. Across the world, millions watched something that didn't react to fear, and they didn't realize this was the moment the rules began to fail. You're about to witness what happens when a world ruled by fear meets something that cannot feel it. Subscribe, because what follows isn't a single catastrophe but a chain of consequences, and missing the next part means missing when control finally disappears. The robbery was small enough that Vought cameras ignored it. 2 men with rifles had locked down a Brooklyn bank, shouting over each other while police sealed the block outside and reporters filled the air with anxious repetition. Civilians were forced to the marble floor, hands behind their heads, breathing in the smell of dust and old carpet while sirens stacked on top of each other outside. Stanley Ipkiss lay among them, face turned sideways, trying to make himself smaller than the tile. He had moved to New York for quiet work and quiet days, believing that if he stayed unnoticed the world would leave him alone. The messenger bag beside him felt heavier than it should have, as if it were holding something alive instead of wood. One of the robbers paced too close and kicked the bag. The zipper split. The old wooden mask slid out across the floor, spinning once before stopping near the robber's boots. He picked it up for the cameras, grinning as if he had found a prop for a joke nobody else understood. Stanley raised his head just enough to whisper for him not to put it on. His voice shook so badly the words barely formed. The robber laughed, turned the mask over in his hands, and slipped it onto his face for the amusement of the hostages, and the lens pointed through the front window. Everything changed in a way nobody in the room could explain later. The robber didn't stumble or hesitate. His body snapped upright with a violent twitch, like a puppet yanked by invisible strings. His spine arched. His arms stretched too far. His mouth split into a grin that was not his own, wide and polished like something painted on. He stood still for one long second, while the other robber swore at him to stop messing around. Then the ceiling exploded. Not cracked, not shattered. It peeled upward like paper as if a giant hand had ripped the roof off the building. Sunlight poured in along with bricks, dust, and the sound of something laughing far too loudly for the size of the room. The man in the mask landed back on the floor without falling. He held a giant red boxing glove on a spring that hadn't existed a moment earlier. He fired it across the room and hit his partner so hard the man went through a teller desk, through the wall behind it, and out into the street in a spray of wood and plaster. Outside, police opened fire on instinct. Bullets hit the masked man in the chest and face. They made flat, rubbery sounds and fell to the ground like spitballs. He blinked at them, unimpressed, then reached into thin air and pulled out 2 oversized cymbals. He clapped them together around a charging officer's head. The officer didn't bounce. He dropped, helmet crushed, blood spreading across the marble floor while the cymbals rang with a cheerful metallic echo that didn't belong in the room. Stanley crawled backward, shaking, watching a man move like gravity had no authority over him. The masked figure glanced at him for a brief moment, and Stanley saw something familiar behind the impossible grin. It was the worst part. It felt like looking at himself through broken glass. The masked man grabbed a desk and swung it like a baseball bat into the front wall. The bank opened to the street in a cloud of debris, and daylight revealed the police barricade outside just in time for the desk to hit 3 squad cars at once. News cameras caught everything. They caught the masked man stepping into the street, dusting his hands off as if he had just finished a chore. They caught the sirens, the screaming, the confusion as officers backed away from something that didn't respond to bullets or fear. They also caught the moment Homelander arrived. He dropped from the sky with perfect posture and controlled rage, landing in the center of the street hard enough to crack the asphalt. His cape settled behind him as he looked at the destruction, the injured officers, the collapsed storefront, and finally the grinning green figure standing in the middle of it all. Homelander spoke, but the words didn't matter because the masked man blew a party horn in his face that extended 20 feet and slapped him across the jaw with a squeak. The street went silent for half a second. Then Homelander punched him. The impact launched the masked man through the side of an apartment building. Concrete burst outward. Windows disintegrated. People screamed from inside as floors partially gave way. Dust swallowed the block in seconds. Homelander hovered in the air, waiting for the body to fall. Instead, the masked man peeled himself off the exposed brick like a sticker, reshaped his face with both hands, and gave a thumbs up. He reached into nowhere and pulled out a giant wooden mallet. He swung. The mallet connected with Homelander's head with a hollow cartoon thud that echoed across the street. Homelander shot downward into the pavement hard enough to crater the road, disappearing in a spray of asphalt and smoke. No one laughed, because the apartment building behind them kept collapsing. Floors pancaked into each other, while people screamed from windows that no longer had anything beneath them. The masked man looked over his shoulder at the destruction as if mildly surprised it hadn't stopped. He shrugged and pulled an anvil out of thin air. He dropped it into the crater. Homelander vanished under 10 tons of iron that should not have existed. The masked man clapped his hands together, pleased with himself, while sirens multiplied in every direction and helicopters circled above, broadcasting the entire thing live. Stanley stumbled out of the ruined bank and into the street. He watched in horror as the world reacted like this was still a normal superhuman incident, like it would end the way these things always ended. He knew it wouldn't, because nothing about this followed rules he understood. The masked man spotted him and waved enthusiastically. Stanley backed away, tears mixing with dust on his face, realizing with sick clarity that the part of him inside that creature was enjoying this far too much. Around them, cameras zoomed in, reporters shouted over each other, and social media feeds exploded with clips that people would replay millions of times before the day ended. Above the street, helicopters repositioned for a better angle. Beneath the anvil, the ground began to crack as Homelander pushed upward through impossible weight. His eyes glowed red, not with confidence but with something closer to confusion. He had never hit anything that didn't care. The masked man waited patiently, tapping his foot, grinning wider. And across the city, across the country, across the world, people watched the moment fear stopped being the strongest thing in the room. Because this wasn't a fight. It was the first time the rules of their world failed in public, and nobody understood yet that the damage would not stop when the cameras turned away. Homelander rose from beneath the anvil slowly, not because he was trapped, but because for the first time in years, he didn't understand what had just happened. The iron slab slid off him and crushed the remains of a police cruiser as he stood, dust rolling off his shoulders while cameras zoomed in from every possible angle. His expression wasn't rage yet. It was confusion trying to disguise itself as control. The mask clapped enthusiastically like he had just watched a stage performance. He leaned forward with exaggerated excitement, pointing at Homelander as if encouraging him to try again. The grin never faded, never shifted, never showed even a trace of tension. Homelander moved faster than the eye could follow. He grabbed the mask by the throat and shot straight up into the sky, disappearing between buildings in a blur of red, white, and green. Helicopters struggled to track them as they broke through a cloud layer and vanished from view. The live feed switched to shaky speculation and panicked commentary. A second later, both of them came back down like meteors. They hit the street hard enough to split the asphalt for half a block. The shockwave shattered windows in every direction, sending glass into the faces of people who had been watching from what they thought was a safe distance. Several never got back up. At the center of the crater, Homelander held the mask buried halfway into the pavement. The mask's body was twisted at impossible angles, flattened into the road like gum pressed into concrete. He blinked twice, reached up, and pulled himself free by his own face. His skull stretched like rubber before snapping back into place with a pop. Homelander stared. The mask reached into nowhere and produced a handheld mirror. He held it up to Homelander's face and tilted it slightly so the cameras could see the reflection too. Dust covered Homelander's hair. His jaw was clenched too tight. His eyes didn't look heroic. They looked rattled. Homelander slapped the mirror away so hard it embedded into a nearby storefront. He grabbed the mask again and began punching him repeatedly into the street, each impact sending chunks of pavement into the air. The sound was sickening, rhythmic, violent enough to feel real even to the viewers watching from home. With each punch, the mask's body flattened, stretched, twisted. And with each punch, he popped back into shape, smiling. People stopped cheering on social media. The tone shifted in real time from spectacle to something closer to dread. This didn't look like a fight. It looked like someone trying to hurt a thing that didn't register pain. Homelander's punches slowed, not from fatigue, but from the creeping realization that nothing he did mattered. The mask gently tapped Homelander's forehead with one finger. Homelander flew backward through a parked bus. The bus didn't bounce. It folded inward, metal wrapping around him like foil. Passengers inside were crushed instantly. Their bodies didn't move afterward. The mask looked at the wreckage, then at his own finger as if mildly impressed. Sirens were constant now. Military helicopters had joined the news crews. Orders were being shouted over encrypted channels. Nobody on the ground knew what weapon would even apply to what they were seeing. Stanley Ipkiss stood on the edge of the destruction, shaking so badly he couldn't breathe properly. He watched the mask move through the chaos with playful curiosity, while the consequences stacked around him in piles of broken glass, crushed vehicles, and bodies that weren't getting up. He realized something horrible. The mask wasn't trying to hurt people. He simply didn't understand that they could be hurt. Homelander tore himself free from the bus and hovered above the street. His cape hung lower than before. His eyes burned red, not in performance but in anger that felt personal now. He wasn't fighting a villain. He was fighting something that made him look powerless. He screamed and unleashed his heat vision. Twin beams of red carved through the mask's chest, slicing the street behind him in half and igniting a gas line that exploded down the block. Fire raced through storefronts. People ran in every direction, some of them already burning. The mask looked down at the smoking hole in his torso. He poked a finger through it, shrugged, then inflated himself like a balloon until the hole sealed with a squeaky snap. Homelander stopped firing. The mask inhaled deeply and exhaled a gust of cartoon wind, so strong it sent Homelander tumbling backward through 3 buildings in a row. Each one collapsed slightly more than the last, like dominoes made of brick and human panic. Cameras caught every angle. The footage hit the internet before Vought could even think about controlling it. Clips looped endlessly of Homelander punching, blasting, screaming, and achieving absolutely nothing. The grin in green never changed. For the first time in his life, Homelander was losing control of the narrative. He landed again, slower this time, eyes locked on the mask with something that wasn't fury anymore. It was unease. He spoke, but the mask responded by pulling out a director's clapboard and snapping it in Homelander's face as if resetting a scene. The humiliation was subtle but devastating. This wasn't defeat, it was mockery. And the world was watching their god get treated like a prop. From a rooftop, Billy Butcher lowered his binoculars slightly, his jaw tight. MM stood beside him, silent, watching the street dissolve into something that didn't follow any pattern he understood. Frenchie muttered in disbelief. Kimiko didn't blink. Butcher spoke quietly, more to himself than to them. That thing's worse than any soup. Below them, the mask reached into thin air again and pulled out a giant camera. He pointed it at Homelander and pretended to take photos, complete with exaggerated flashes. Each flash blinded onlookers temporarily and sent more panic through the crowd. Homelander rushed him again. The mask stepped aside casually, and Homelander crashed into a fire engine, flipping it onto its side. Firefighters inside were thrown against steel and didn't move afterward. The mask looked at the truck, then at Homelander, then pulled out a referee whistle and blew it loudly. Stanley covered his ears. He could feel it now, the realization forming slowly in his mind that this wasn't a battle. This was a collision between two different realities, and only one of them obeyed consequences. The other one didn't even recognize them. Homelander floated above the street again, breathing hard, staring at the mask with open disbelief. Around them, entire sections of the block were destroyed. Fires spread. Ambulances couldn't get close enough. Reporters were crying on live television without realizing it. The mask waved cheerfully at a news helicopter. And in that moment, the world saw something they had never seen before. Homelander didn't look strong. He looked small. By the time the fires were contained, the footage had already spread beyond anything Vought's media division could suppress. Clips of Homelander hammering the green-suited man into pavement, blasting him with heat vision, and being casually swatted aside were looping across every platform on Earth. Edits appeared within minutes. Memes appeared within seconds. The tone was wrong for Vought, and they felt it immediately. Inside Vought Tower, executives watched the same footage over and over in silence. Not because of the destruction, but because of what it did to the image they had spent decades engineering. Homelander wasn't feared in those clips. He wasn't revered. He was being treated like part of the joke. Ashley Barrett paced in front of a wall of screens, talking too fast for anyone to follow. Marketing teams were already trying to frame the incident as a rogue experimental soup. Legal teams were drafting statements that used words like anomaly, prototype, and classified. Nobody wanted to say what the footage actually showed. A thing that didn't obey anything. They didn't know yet that the real damage wasn't the buildings. It was the laughter online. Millions of people watching the world's most powerful man fail repeatedly and sharing it with giddy disbelief. Vought made the first decision that would accelerate everything. They decided to brand him. A digital team isolated the green suit, the exaggerated grin, the impossible physics, and began working on a narrative. If they could frame him as a new kind of soup, something experimental, something exciting, they could contain the story inside familiar language. If they could turn him into content, they could take control back. They didn't understand that attention was exactly what he fed on. Across the city, Stanley Ipkiss sat in the back of an ambulance, wrapped in a blanket, staring at nothing. Paramedics spoke to him, but he barely heard them. Every time he blinked, he saw the mask waving at helicopters while people screamed beneath falling debris. He kept whispering the same sentence under his breath. That's not how it's supposed to work. Because in his world, the mask was absurd but contained, harmless in a way that relied on everything around it being able to reset. Here, nothing reset. Everything broke and stayed broken. A television mounted in the ambulance replayed the fight for the third time. Stanley watched Homelander's punches again, watched the mask inflate himself back into shape, and realized with rising horror that the mask wasn't trying to hurt Homelander. He was playing. Outside, military vehicles were now blocking entire streets. Armed units were being deployed with no clear instructions beyond containment. They didn't know what they were containing. They just knew the city felt different, like gravity had been replaced with something unpredictable. On a rooftop 2 blocks away, Butcher watched the soldiers move in with equipment that would work on any known soup. Net launchers, high-caliber rifles, sonic disruptors. He shook his head slowly. "They're about to learn," he muttered. Didn't ask what he meant. He was watching the smoke rising from buildings that had housed families an hour earlier. The mask reappeared without warning. One moment the street was filled with armored personnel. The next he was standing in the middle of them holding a stack of folding chairs like he had just arrived at a picnic. Soldiers shouted commands. Rifles aimed. Orders overlapped in panicked layers. He unfolded one chair and sat down calmly. They fired anyway. Bullets flattened against him and dropped to the asphalt. He leaned back in the chair and crossed his legs, watching them as if mildly entertained. Then he reached behind his back and pulled out a bucket of popcorn. Several soldiers froze. This didn't match training. It didn't match anything. The mask looked at them one by one, then suddenly flung the popcorn into the air. Each kernel hit like a marble shot from a cannon, cracking visors, breaking teeth, dropping people instantly. The survivors scattered. Cameras caught this too. Within minutes, Vought's official social accounts posted the first edited clip with a caption framing the mask as an unidentified experimental soup with unpredictable abilities. They pushed the idea that Homelander had intervened heroically to prevent greater casualties. The problem was that the raw footage was everywhere. People could see the difference. Homelander returned to Vought Tower without a word. He walked past employees who avoided eye contact and into a private conference room where Ashley waited with forced composure. She started speaking the moment the door closed, explaining the narrative they were pushing, the hashtags already trending, the framing they were trying to build. Homelander didn't respond. He was staring at a screen, replaying the moment the mask held up the mirror to his face. He watched himself again. He didn't look powerful, he looked frustrated, small, confused. Ashley kept talking, unaware that every word about branding and messaging was making something in him crack a little further. She said they could turn this into a win if they acted fast enough, that the public just needed direction on how to interpret what they saw. Homelander asked a single question. "What is it?" Ashley didn't have an answer. Back on the street, the mask had climbed onto the hood of a military truck and was conducting traffic like an orchestra conductor, waving his arms while vehicles swerved chaotically around each other. Several collided. One flipped. The mask applauded as if impressed with the performance. Stanley watched from the ambulance as the world outside moved like a cartoon, while the consequences piled up like a war zone. He felt something worse than fear. He felt recognition. The mask fit here too easily. News commentators began shifting their tone. What started as shock turned into confusion. Analysts debated whether this was some new kind of soup or something else entirely. Experts spoke with false authority about physics, biology, and classified programs, trying to explain what had no explanation. Every time they replayed the footage, more people laughed. And every time people laughed, the situation felt less serious than it actually was. That was the part nobody understood yet. The laughter was feeding the chaos. On the rooftop, Butcher lowered his binoculars and finally said what had been forming in his mind since the fight started. "We don't kill that thing," he said quietly. "We figure out how to stop it from moving." Below them, the mask stood in the middle of an intersection, pulling out an enormous film camera and pointing it directly at a crowd of civilians who had gathered at a distance to watch. He adjusted the lens, waved cheerfully, and snapped a photo. A blinding flash erupted. When the light faded, dozens of people were temporarily blind, screaming and stumbling into traffic that hadn't stopped moving. The mask checked the photo, nodded approvingly, and tucked it into his jacket. And somewhere in Vought Tower, marketing teams were already designing a logo. By late afternoon, New York no longer felt like a city reacting to a superhuman incident. It felt like a place trying to function, while gravity quietly stopped making sense. Traffic signals blinked uselessly over intersections filled with stalled cars. Emergency routes were blocked by debris that nobody had time to clear. Sirens overlapped so constantly that people stopped reacting to them at all. The mask wandered through it like a tourist. He stepped over crushed metal and shattered glass with casual curiosity, occasionally stopping to examine something as if it were part of a museum exhibit. A destroyed storefront, a flipped ambulance, a section of sidewalk that had split open from the earlier impacts. Each time he reacted with exaggerated fascination, like the damage itself was part of the entertainment. People began filming him instead of running. That was the shift. Fear didn't stop them from holding up their phones. If anything, the absurdity of what they were seeing made them want to capture it more. Clips streamed live to millions of viewers who were still trying to process whether this was horror or spectacle. Every time someone laughed at the screen, the mask seemed to become more animated. He noticed the cameras now. He posed for them, waved, blew kisses, pulled props from nowhere, and performed like a street entertainer standing in the ruins of a war zone. Behind him, paramedics worked on bodies that wouldn't move again. On a nearby rooftop, Butcher watched through binoculars with growing tension in his jaw. Stood beside him, silent, tracking the movement of emergency crews who were trying to predict where the mask would go next and failing every time. "He's not attacking," said quietly. "No," Butcher replied, "he's existing." And that was worse. At Vought Tower, executives were no longer debating messaging. They were debating damage control. Footage of Homelander's failed attacks had become the most replayed clips online. Analysts were dissecting his expressions frame by frame. Memes had turned him into a punchline within hours. Vought released a statement declaring the green-suited man a dangerous rogue entity that Homelander was working tirelessly to neutralize. The language was firm, authoritative, and completely disconnected from what people had seen with their own eyes. The more Vought tried to control the narrative, the more the narrative slipped. Homelander sat alone in a dark conference room watching the same clips on repeat. He wasn't studying the mask, he was studying himself. The pauses, the hesitation, the moments where his blows should have ended things and didn't. He had never felt small before. Back on the street, the mask stopped in front of a group of National Guard vehicles forming a barricade. Soldiers shouted commands, weapons aimed. Someone yelled for him to get on the ground. The mask looked offended. He reached into the air and pulled out a bright orange traffic cone. Then another, then another. Within seconds, he had created an entire maze of cones between himself and the soldiers. He began jogging through them in exaggerated zigzags like he was completing an obstacle course. Several soldiers fired out of panic. The bullets ricocheted off the cones and struck nearby storefront windows. Glass fell onto civilians who had been watching from inside, thinking the walls still meant safety. The mask reached the end of his cone maze and bowed deeply to an imaginary audience. A truck behind the soldiers exploded from a ruptured fuel line hit by a stray round. Nobody laughed this time. Stanley Ipkiss had been moved to a temporary command center set up in a school gymnasium. Federal agents asked him questions he couldn't answer, while a television in the corner replayed the destruction on loop. He kept staring at the screen, watching the mask interact with the world like it was made of foam. He finally said something that made the agents pause. He doesn't know he's hurting people. They looked at him like he was in shock. But Stanley knew the mask didn't recognize consequence. In his world, buildings bent and popped back into shape. People got flattened and stood up. Chaos was temporary. Here, everything stayed broken. Outside, civilians began imitating him. Someone put on a cheap green mask from a costume store and started dancing on top of a car. A crowd gathered, laughing nervously, filming it. The car rolled forward slightly and pinned someone against a street pole before anyone reacted. The line between spectacle and danger was dissolving. On another block, the mask found a construction site. He picked up a steel beam like it weighed nothing and used it as a jump rope, spinning it so fast it blurred. The beam slipped from his hands and flew across the street, punching through a brick wall and disappearing into a building full of people who had thought they were out of reach. Sirens shifted direction again. The mask scratched his head, mildly confused, then shrugged and walked away. Butcher lowered his binoculars slowly. "He's not a threat because he's violent," he said. "He's a threat because he's careless." MM nodded. "We can't predict careless." At Vought, marketing teams had already drafted merchandise mock-ups. Green suit, wide grin, catchphrases pulled from edited clips. Executives debated whether leaning into the absurdity might actually work in their favor. If they could turn him into a brand before the public decided he was a disaster, they could still ride the wave. They approved a soft launch of social posts using his image. Within minutes, the mask appeared on a giant digital billboard in Times Square as part of a breaking news graphic. He stopped in the middle of the street and stared up at it. Then he waved at his own face. Crowds nearby began cheering. Phones lifted again. People laughed at the surreal sight of him interacting with a screen that had turned him into content. The mask took a theatrical bow. Behind him, a partially damaged building that had been unstable since the morning finally gave way and collapsed onto the sidewalk where dozens had gathered to watch. The cheering stopped. Dust swallowed the block again. The mask looked over his shoulder at the noise, then back at the billboard, as if unsure which was more interesting. In the command center, Stanley saw it happen live and felt his stomach drop. He realized something with awful clarity. Vought wasn't containing this. They were amplifying it. And every time the mask saw himself on a screen, he behaved like he had an audience to entertain. Outside, the National Guard began pulling back, not because they had orders to retreat, but because they didn't know how to engage without making things worse. The city felt less like a crisis zone and more like an environment that had lost its rules. The mask walked through an intersection, humming to himself, stepping over debris and bodies with the same casual indifference. Above him, drones, helicopters, and cameras tracked every move. And across the city, people were no longer sure whether to hide or to watch. Because watching felt safer. They didn't realize, yet that watching was exactly what was feeding the disaster. By early evening, the federal response stopped pretending this was a superhuman incident and started treating it like a national security breach. Airspace over Manhattan was restricted. Armored convoys rolled in from surrounding boroughs. Orders were issued that hadn't been used on domestic soil in decades, all of them built on the assumption that force could solve confusion. The problem was that nobody could define the target. The mask wandered into a wide avenue now cleared of civilians by sheer exhaustion. Soldiers lined both ends of the street with armored vehicles forming a corridor. Snipers took positions on rooftops. Drones hovered overhead, feeding live thermal imagery to command units miles away. He looked around, impressed. He clapped slowly, as if appreciating the effort. A command came through loudspeakers demanding surrender. The mask tilted his head, pretending to listen carefully, then reached behind his back and pulled out a white flag the size of a bedsheet. He waved it cheerfully. Several soldiers hesitated. Then the flagpole extended like a spear and punched through the hood of an armored vehicle behind them, rupturing the engine block in a spray of metal. The vehicle burst into flames instantly, and the formation broke in panic as personnel scrambled away from the blast. The mask examined the flagpole, shrugged, and snapped it in half like a twig. From a rooftop, Butcher watched the coordination dissolve. MM stood beside him, listening to overlapping radio chatter from multiple frequencies bleeding into each other. Orders were being given, countermanded, and misunderstood all at once. "They're throwing doctrine at a cartoon," Butcher muttered. A thunderous roar filled the sky as two fighter jets screamed overhead at low altitude. They released precision-guided munitions designed to incapacitate hardened targets without leveling entire blocks. The missiles struck the street directly in front of the mask, erupting in fire and shockwaves that rattled buildings for blocks. Smoke swallowed the avenue. When it cleared, the mask was standing inside a perfectly circular hole in the pavement, untouched, holding a small umbrella over his head like he had just waited out rain. He shook it dry and tucked it away. The blast had shattered windows across multiple buildings. Glass rained into apartments where people had thought they were finally safe. Several fell from upper floors trying to escape the sudden chaos. The mask stepped out of the crater and began brushing dust off his sleeves. Command escalated again. A sonic weapon mounted on a truck unleashed a high-frequency blast meant to disorient SUPs with enhanced senses. The sound warped the air visibly, making nearby soldiers clutch their heads and drop to their knees in pain. The mask blinked twice, then pulled out a pair of oversized earmuffs and slipped them on. He smiled and gave a thumbs up while the sonic wave continued to cripple everyone else in range. He walked over to the truck calmly and tapped it with one finger. The entire vehicle folded inward like a crushed soda can, trapping the operators inside with a metallic shriek that echoed down the street. Butcher lowered his binoculars again. "They're doing the damage for him," he said quietly. In Vought Tower, executives watched the live feeds with expressions that had shifted from anxiety to fear. They could see what the public was seeing now. Military hardware failing in ways that looked ridiculous on screen but catastrophic in reality. Ashley demanded that Homelander re-engage. She insisted this was the moment to restore public faith, to show control, to remind people who the strongest being in the world was. Homelander didn't respond at first. He was watching footage of the mask interacting with soldiers like they were toys. The humiliation from earlier hadn't faded. It had deepened into something raw and unstable. He finally stood and left the room without a word. Back on the avenue, the mask spotted a tank rolling forward cautiously. He squinted at it like he was trying to remember where he had seen one before. Then he reached into thin air and pulled out a giant bottle opener. He hooked it under the tank's turret and popped it clean off with a cheerful metallic sound. The turret bounced down the street, crushing parked cars before coming to rest against a storefront. Inside the tank, the crew screamed. The mask tossed the bottle opener away and applauded himself. Cameras caught everything. Social feeds were no longer filled with jokes. The tone had shifted into something else entirely. People were beginning to understand that nothing deployed against him worked, and everything deployed around him made things worse. In the command center, Stanley watched this unfold on multiple screens. He could hear analysts trying to categorize the mask's abilities with technical language that didn't apply. He shook his head slowly. "He's not fighting them," Stanley whispered. "He's playing with what they bring." A general overheard him and turned. "What stops him?" Stanley didn't answer. Because he didn't know. The sky split again, as Homelander returned. He descended into the avenue with controlled fury, landing hard enough to crack the pavement again. Soldiers backed away instinctively, clearing space as if this were a duel they had no part in. Homelander didn't speak this time. He grabbed the mask and flew straight up without warning, climbing so fast that the city became a blur beneath them. Cameras lost them in seconds. Radar struggled to track their speed. They reappeared moments later, crashing back down through the roof of a parking garage several blocks away. The structure folded inward from the impact, pancaking cars and people inside who had taken shelter there earlier in the day. Dust rolled out through the shattered entrance like smoke from a furnace. The mask stepped out first, adjusting his tie. Homelander followed, slower, eyes burning red, breathing harder than before. He unleashed heat vision again, carving through the mask and through the garage behind him, igniting fuel tanks and sending secondary explosions through multiple levels. The mask inflated his chest like a balloon, sealing the damage instantly, then pulled out a fire extinguisher and sprayed Homelander in the face with thick white foam. Homelander staggered backward, blinded. The mask honked a bicycle horn directly into his ear. The sound echoed, absurdly loud in the ruined structure. Outside, soldiers watched their most powerful asset get treated like part of a gag, while the garage continued collapsing behind them, trapping anyone still inside. Butcher watched from a distance and felt something settle into certainty. They couldn't kill this thing. They had to learn how to limit the space around it before it interacted with anything else. Because the more the world brought to the mask, the more the mask turned it into a weapon against itself. And as Homelander wiped foam from his eyes, looking more shaken than enraged, the realization spread quietly through everyone watching. Force wasn't failing. It was feeding the disaster. By nightfall, Manhattan was no longer the center of the event. It was the broadcast studio. Every major network had switched to uninterrupted live coverage. Social platforms throttled nothing. International feeds picked up the same angles from drones, helicopters, and civilian phones. What had started as a local disaster had become the most watched live event in modern history. And the mask knew it. He stood in the middle of an empty intersection illuminated by emergency lights, turning slowly in a circle as if admiring the cameras hovering around him. He waved at one drone, then another, pointing at himself proudly like a performer acknowledging applause. Behind him, entire blocks were dark from power failures. Fires still burned in places nobody could safely reach. The city groaned under damage that would take months to repair, if repair was even possible. But the feeds didn't linger on the destruction. They lingered on him. In Vought Tower, analytics teams displayed real-time viewership numbers climbing past records set by wars and elections. Executives watched the graphs with horrified fascination. Every spike in engagement corresponded to another clip of the mask doing something impossible. Ashley finally said what nobody wanted to admit. We made him famous. They had tried to brand him hours earlier. Now he existed as a global spectacle beyond their control. The more people watched, the more animated he became. It was subtle but undeniable. He posed longer, reacted bigger, played to angles that cameras favored. Attention wasn't just documenting the disaster. It was shaping it. In the command center, Stanley watched multiple screens at once. He saw feeds from Tokyo, London, Sao Paulo, all replaying the same moments from earlier in the day. Commentators debated whether this was an alien, a god, a classified experiment. Nobody had a language for what he was. Stanley spoke quietly, almost to himself. He thinks this is a show. A federal analyst leaned closer. What does that mean? It means, Stanley said, swallowing hard, the more people watch, the more he performs. Outside, the mask found a row of abandoned taxis and began stacking them into a pyramid with exaggerated care. Each car scraped loudly across the asphalt, metal grinding against metal. He stepped back to admire the structure, then climbed to the top and took a theatrical bow to the cameras. The bottom car gave way under the weight. The pyramid collapsed in a violent cascade of steel, crushing a nearby news van and sending debris into a group of reporters who had edged too close for a better shot. Screams cut through the night. The mask winced sympathetically, then held up a small sign that read "Oops" before tossing it aside. On a rooftop, Butcher watched with growing clarity. MM stood beside him, arms folded, face tense. "He's learning the audience," MM said. "No," Butcher replied, "the audience is teaching him." Because every time people reacted, the mask adjusted. He lingered where cameras gathered. He moved toward crowds that tried to document him. He wasn't chasing attention. Attention was guiding him. Homelander hovered above the city, watching from a distance now. He wasn't engaging. He was observing, trying to understand something that didn't fit into strength or dominance. His expression had shifted from anger to something closer to unease. He saw the way the mask played to the cameras. He saw the way people were still watching instead of running. For the first time, Homelander felt like he wasn't the center of the world's gaze anymore. The mask suddenly froze mid-performance and tilted his head as if hearing something. Then he reached into thin air and pulled out a giant remote control. He pointed it toward a cluster of news helicopters and pressed a button. Their cameras shut off simultaneously. Pilots panicked, thinking it was a systems failure. They veered off course, nearly colliding as they tried to regain control. The mask grinned and pressed another button. The cameras flickered back on. He was playing with the broadcast itself. Across the globe, viewers gasped as feeds blinked in and out. Commentators stammered. Technicians scrambled to explain what had no explanation. The mask looked delighted by the reaction and began clicking the remote repeatedly, turning cameras on and off like a child flipping a light switch. Several helicopters clipped each other in the confusion and spiraled downward into buildings that were already unstable. But the feed stayed live. Stanley felt a chill run through him. "He can see them," he whispered. "He knows where the cameras are." In Vought Tower, executives realized something even worse. Their own drones, their own live feeds, were giving the mask a map of attention. Every lens pointed at him was a beacon. They began issuing orders to pull back coverage. But it was too late. Independent streamers, civilians, foreign networks, there were too many eyes now. The event had grown beyond anything a corporation could contain. On the street, the mask spotted a group of civilians hiding behind a barricade, phones raised cautiously. He tiptoed toward them with exaggerated stealth, then popped up in front of their cameras with a wide grin. They screamed and stumbled backward into the road, just as an emergency vehicle swerved to avoid debris and couldn't stop in time. The mask looked down at the scene, then back at the phone still recording from the ground. He posed. Butcher lowered his head slowly. "He's not chasing chaos," he said. "Chaos is chasing him." Homelander descended again, not to fight, but to stand in the same intersection as the mask. For a moment, neither of them moved. The cameras focused tightly on the two figures standing amid wreckage and firelight. The mask smiled and waved at Homelander like an old friend. Homelander didn't respond. He looked around at the destruction, at the fires still burning, at the civilians who had stopped running just to watch. Something in his expression shifted again. This wasn't anger. It was the realization that strength meant nothing if the world stopped believing in it. The mask pulled out a handheld spotlight and shined it directly on Homelander's face like a performer calling someone on stage. And millions watched the man who ruled by fear stand frozen in a circle of light he didn't control. Butcher stopped watching the mask and started watching everything around him. The fires, the vehicles, the soldiers, the civilians with phones, the helicopters circling at what they believed was a safe distance. He wasn't looking at the chaos as random anymore. He was looking for the pattern hiding underneath it. And the pattern wasn't violence. It was interaction. Every time someone brought something into the mask space, the mask used it. Not intentionally, not maliciously, simply because it was there. Guns, vehicles, cameras, people, buildings, all of it became part of the performance the moment it entered his reach. Noticed the shift in Butcher's posture. "You got something," he said. Butcher nodded slowly. "He's not a weapon, he's a mirror. Whatever's near him gets exaggerated." Frenchie looked back down at the street. "So what do we do?" Butcher didn't hesitate. "We give him nothing." That was the first useful idea anyone had all day. Below them, the mask was still standing in the intersection with Homelander, the spotlight shining into Homelander's eyes. Cameras hovered, zoomed, adjusted. The world was still watching the standoff like it meant something. Butcher grabbed a radio from an abandoned emergency kit and began broadcasting on open channels. He didn't identify himself. He didn't explain who he was. He just gave instructions in a tone that forced people to listen. "Clear the blocks, shut off the lights, pull back everything that moves." At first, nobody obeyed. Then commanders who were desperate for any plan began relaying the orders. Soldiers started retreating. Helicopters widened their distance. Police vehicles reversed out of intersections. The city began to empty around the mask. The change was subtle but immediate. The mask looked around, confused, as sirens faded into the distance and the constant motion around him slowed. He turned in a slow circle, searching for something to react to. Homelander noticed it too. For the first time, the mask didn't have anything new to play with. Vought Tower received the same instruction through federal channels. Ashley argued against it, terrified of losing visual coverage. But executives above her understood what was happening faster. They ordered their drones to pull back. Screens in the tower began going dark one by one. The mask frowned slightly as the number of cameras visibly tracking him decreased. He pulled out the remote control again and pressed a button. Nothing happened. He pressed it again. Still nothing. For the first time since this began, the grin wavered just slightly into confusion. Stanley watched this unfold on a dimming bank of monitors and realized Butcher's idea might be the first thing that made sense. The mask needed stimulus. Without it, he didn't know what to do next. On the street, entire avenues were now empty. Fires still burned, but nobody rushed in to fight them. No vehicles moved. No crowds gathered. Windows were dark as people hid instead of filming. The mask walked down the center of the road slowly, looking into empty storefronts like a performer stepping onto a stage after the audience has left. He tried to pull out a giant prop hammer. It appeared, but he hesitated. There was nothing to swing it at. He set it down and scratched his head. Homelander hovered nearby, watching carefully. He didn't attack. He didn't speak. He simply observed the change. The mask's movements were less energetic now, less reactive. He looked around for something new and found nothing. Butcher spoke into the radio again. "Keep it empty. Don't engage, don't chase, don't film." Across the city, people obeyed out of fear and exhaustion. Streets emptied faster. Even civilian live streams began dropping as people realized they might be making things worse by watching. The silence started to spread. The mask stopped in the middle of Times Square, now dark except for emergency lighting. The giant billboards had gone black. No flashing images, no news feeds, no audience. He turned slowly, confused. Then he pulled out a spotlight again and shined it around the empty streets, searching for something to illuminate. Nothing moved. Butcher exhaled slowly. "He needs the world to push back," he said. "If the world stops reacting, he doesn't know how to continue." Nodded. "So we starve him." In the command center, Stanley whispered, "He's bored." And boredom for the mask was unfamiliar territory. He tried a few more tricks, pulled out oversized props, juggled invisible objects, made exaggerated gestures to empty air. None of it landed. There was no reaction, no laughter, no panic, no movement. The city had become a void around him. Homelander landed quietly a short distance away, watching the mask pace slowly now. The man in green looked smaller somehow without chaos to frame him, less like a spectacle, more like something out of place. Homelander didn't feel triumphant. He felt unsettled. Because this thing that had humiliated him all day was now wandering aimlessly like it didn't understand where the world had gone. And the world was deliberately staying away. The mask finally stopped and stood perfectly still in the center of the empty square. He blinked a few times, then shrugged to himself as if accepting a strange new rule. He sat down cross-legged on the pavement and waited. From the rooftop, Butcher watched that happen and felt a grim certainty settle in. "We can't beat him," he said, "but we can make the world too quiet for him to break." Below, the mask tilted his head slightly, listening to the silence of a city that had stopped responding to him. And for the first time all day, nothing else collapsed. The silence didn't feel like safety. It felt like something holding its breath. Entire districts of Manhattan remained dark and empty as authorities extended the withdrawal radius block by block. No sirens, no helicopters, no traffic. Fires were allowed to burn out on their own because sending crews in meant giving the mask something to interact with. The city wasn't being protected anymore. It was being abandoned strategically. And the mask was sitting in the middle of it. He hadn't moved for nearly 20 minutes, cross-legged on the asphalt of Times Square, head tilted slightly, eyes scanning streets that no longer answered him. The grin stayed in place, but his body language had slowed into something closer to confusion than energy. Homelander watched from a rooftop, arms folded, saying nothing. He had expected relief when the chaos stopped. Instead, he felt something worse. Without noise, without destruction, without people screaming, the entire day replayed in his head with uncomfortable clarity. Every failed strike, every moment of hesitation, every time the mask had treated him like part of a joke. And now the mask wasn't even looking at him. In the command center, Stanley stared at a single drone feed kept at maximum distance. The mask looked small on the screen, surrounded by empty streets and dark billboards. Analysts spoke in hushed tones now, as if loud voices might wake something. "He's waiting," someone said. Stanley shook his head. "He's listening." Because this kind of quiet didn't exist in the mask's world. There was always noise, always reaction, always bounce back. This silence was foreign and the mask didn't know how to process it. But the world outside, Manhattan hadn't gone quiet. Millions were still watching recorded clips, still replaying footage, still sharing edits, memes, commentary. The event had gone from live spectacle to global replay. And even though the city had stopped reacting, the audience hadn't. That was the problem nobody had accounted for. The mask suddenly stood up. Not because anything moved nearby, because something shifted in his awareness. He looked up at the sky, then slowly turned toward the skyline beyond Times Square, as if sensing attention coming from somewhere else. He reached into thin air and pulled out a large satellite dish. He held it to his ear like a listening device. In the command center, screens flickered, signals jittered. The drone feed cut for half a second before stabilizing again. Technicians scrambled to explain interference that didn't have a source. The mask turned the dish slightly, adjusting it like he was tuning a radio. He wasn't listening to the city. He was listening to the world watching the city. Butcher realized it first. "He doesn't need us here," he said quietly. "He's feeling the eyes from everywhere else." Looked at him sharply. "You saying the silence doesn't matter?" "It matters here," Butcher replied, "but he's not limited to here anymore." On the screen, the mask nodded to himself as if satisfied with what he heard. He tossed the satellite dish aside and began walking again, but not randomly this time. He moved with a strange new purpose, heading toward a district that had been completely evacuated. He reached an intersection lined with parked cars and stopped. He looked at the empty vehicles, then at the dark buildings, then back toward the sky. He snapped his fingers. Every car alarm went off at once. The sound tore through the silence like a siren chorus, echoing, overlapping, disorienting. In apartments where people had been hiding quietly, the sudden noise caused panic. Some ran to windows to see what was happening. Some stepped outside without thinking. The mask smiled wider. He wasn't reacting to people anymore. He was creating reasons for them to react. Stanley felt his stomach drop. "He's trying to make noise," he whispered. The mask began jumping from car to car, landing on hoods with exaggerated stomps that set off more alarms. The noise multiplied block by block. The quiet Manhattan had worked so hard to create began unraveling. In a nearby building, a man leaned out a window to see what was happening just as the mask leaped onto the fire escape beneath him. The structure tore free from the wall under the impact, sending both of them crashing to the street. The alarms kept blaring. Homelander watched this from above and felt something tighten in his chest. The mask had adapted. The absence of stimulus had forced him to create his own. And this time it wasn't playful. It was deliberate. Butcher grabbed the radio again. "Kill the power grid," he ordered. "Everything now." Within minutes, entire sections of Manhattan went black. Car alarms died mid-scream. Streetlights vanished. The city plunged into a darkness broken only by distant firelight. The mask stopped mid-jump, landing softly on the roof of a sedan. He looked around at the sudden blackness. Then he reached into the air and pulled out a glowing lantern, holding it up high like an explorer in a cave. The light illuminated him in a perfect circle. He took a slow step forward. In the darkness, that single moving light became the most terrifying thing in the city. People watching from windows pulled back instinctively, phones lowered, breath held again. The mask walked down the dark street with the lantern swinging gently from his hand, humming to himself, creating his own spotlight in a world that had tried to hide from him. The silence had not stopped him. It had changed him. He wasn't waiting for the world to react anymore. He was figuring out how to make it react again. The lantern light moved slowly through the blackout like a living thing. From rooftops and windows, people watched that glow drift between abandoned cars and dark storefronts, never sure where it would appear next. The city had tried to erase itself from the mask's attention. Now the mask was carving a path through the dark, one step at a time, turning absence into theater. He stopped in the middle of a wide intersection and raised the lantern higher. Then he reached into thin air and pulled out a portable generator the size of a suitcase. He set it down, yanked a cord, and the machine roared to life with a cheerful sputter. He plugged the lantern into it. Streetlights flickered back on in a perfect circle around him. Not the whole block, just a stage. The light drew eyes immediately. Curtains shifted. Phones lifted despite everything people had learned. The instinct to watch was stronger than the instinct to hide. The mask turned slowly, acknowledging the silhouettes in the windows like an audience settling into seats. From a rooftop, Butcher watched the ring of light form and felt the plan unravel in his hands. "He's building his own set," he muttered. Didn't look away, so we cut the power again. Butcher shook his head. "He'll just make another one." Because the mask wasn't reacting to infrastructure anymore. He was improvising it. In the command center, Stanley leaned closer to the screen. "He's figured it out," he whispered. "He doesn't need us to bring him things. He can bring his own." On the street, the mask reached into nowhere and began pulling out folding chairs. One by one, he arranged them in a semicircle facing the lit intersection. He dusted each seat carefully, then stepped back to admire the arrangement. The message was unmistakable. If the audience wouldn't come to him, he would set the seats himself. A man across the street opened his apartment window a little wider to see better. The mask snapped his head toward the movement instantly and waved enthusiastically. The man froze, realizing too late that he had drawn attention. He tried to pull back inside just as the mask tossed a lasso made of glowing rope that wrapped around the window frame. With a cheerful tug, the entire frame tore loose from the wall. The man fell with it, landing hard on the pavement below while the mask applauded the entrance. The streetlights hummed overhead. The mask took a seat in one of the folding chairs and crossed his legs, looking around expectantly. He wasn't chasing attention anymore. He was staging it. Homelander hovered at a distance, watching this transformation with growing unease. The earlier humiliation had shifted into something else now. The mask wasn't mocking him anymore. He was evolving past him. This wasn't a fight between two beings. This was a being learning how to reshape the environment without resistance. Vought's analysts watched the same feed with dread. Engagement metrics were climbing again, even though official coverage had been cut. Civilian streams had resumed. People couldn't resist documenting the surreal calm of a glowing intersection in a dead city. Ashley whispered, "He's trending again," like it was a diagnosis. On the street, the mask stood up and pulled out a megaphone. He tapped it twice, creating a feedback squeal that echoed down empty blocks. Then he cleared his throat theatrically and gestured toward the chairs as if inviting people to sit. No one moved. He waited patiently. Then he reached behind his back and pulled out a comically large magnet. He held it toward a nearby apartment building and turned an invisible dial. Metal groaned. Fire escapes tore free. Window frames bent. Pipes screeched inside walls. Objects ripped from buildings and flew toward him in a violent swarm, smashing into the street around the chairs in a chaotic pile. Several people inside those buildings were struck by flying debris they never saw coming. The mask examined the pile with interest, then arranged pieces of it into something resembling a crude stage backdrop. Butcher exhaled slowly. "He's not bored anymore," he said. MM nodded grimly. "He's inspired." Stanley felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. "He's building a world that makes sense to him," he said. "One where the audience always exists." The mask placed the megaphone down and clapped his hands twice. From somewhere in the distance, car alarms began again. Not because he had jumped on them this time, but because the magnet had disturbed electrical systems across multiple blocks. The sound rolled toward him like applause. He bowed. The applause wasn't laughter. It was panic. And he couldn't tell the difference. Homelander descended slowly into the edge of the lit circle, watching carefully. The mask turned toward him with visible excitement, like an old friend had finally shown up to the show. He pulled out a second folding chair and gestured for Homelander to sit. Homelander didn't move. He realized something in that moment that unsettled him more than any punch earlier in the day. The mask didn't see him as a threat anymore. He saw him as part of the set. Across the city, more windows lit up as people couldn't resist watching the glowing stage in the distance. Phones lifted again. Streams resumed. The audience was reforming without realizing they were walking back into the pattern. The mask smiled wider. He had learned how to create attention without chaos. And that made him far more dangerous than before. Homelander did not sit in the chair. He remained standing at the edge of the light, staring at the mask with a look that cameras had never captured before. It wasn't rage. It wasn't confidence. It was the dawning realization that he no longer understood the stage he was standing on. The mask waited politely, tapping the empty chair with exaggerated patience, then shrugged when Homelander didn't move. He turned away as if the moment had passed and began rearranging the debris behind him into something more decorative. That was the breaking point. Homelander had spent his entire life being the center of every room, every screen, every narrative. Even when people feared him, they were looking at him. Now the world's eyes were drifting past him towards something he couldn't intimidate, couldn't hurt, couldn't even meaningfully interact with. He wasn't losing a fight. He was losing relevance. From rooftops and windows, people watched the strange tableau below, the glowing circle of light, the folding chairs, the man in green humming to himself while reshaping wreckage into stage props, and the most powerful soup in the world standing uselessly nearby. Homelander spoke, but the mask didn't respond. He raised his voice, louder this time, demanding attention. The mask held up a finger without turning around, a universal gesture asking for a moment of patience. Then he finished adjusting a Bent Street sign and stepped back to admire his work. Homelander's eyes glowed red. He unleashed heat vision again, not at the mask, but at the entire stage. The beams carved through chairs, debris, and pavement, igniting sparks and tearing apart the carefully arranged set. The circle of light flickered as wires melted and snapped. The mask turned slowly, watching the destruction with mild disappointment. He reached into thin air and pulled out a broom. He began sweeping the melted debris into a neat pile while Homelander stood there, breathing hard, realizing he had just destroyed something that only existed because the mask wanted it to. The humiliation was absolute. Butcher watched this from a distance and didn't smile. There was no satisfaction in it, only confirmation. "He's finished," Butcher said quietly, "just doesn't know it yet." MM nodded. He's fighting for attention now. In the command center, Stanley saw Homelander's posture change. Shoulders tighter, movements sharper. The man who once radiated calm dominance now looked like someone trying to prove something to an audience that wasn't convinced. The mask finished sweeping, tossed the broom away, and held up a small hand mirror again. He angled it toward Homelander without saying a word. Homelander saw himself in the reflection. Not as a god, not as a hero. As a man standing in the wreckage of a city he couldn't control, being silently observed by something that didn't care. He slapped the mirror away, so hard it shattered against a wall. The mask blinked, mildly surprised, then reached into nowhere and pulled out another one. Homelander screamed. Not a battle cry. A raw, frustrated sound that echoed down the empty streets. He grabbed the mask and flew upward again, but there was no strategy now. No precision. He slammed the mask into rooftops, into water towers, into brick walls, tearing through structures with reckless force. Each impact collapsed something that had still been standing. Each time the mask bounced back into shape, smiling. Homelander finally stopped midair, hovering, chest heaving, staring at the mask floating in front of him like an untouchable joke. The mask adjusted his tie politely. Homelander didn't attack again. He just stared. Because for the first time in his life, he understood that strength meant nothing if it had no effect. Fear meant nothing if the target couldn't feel it. Power meant nothing if it couldn't change the outcome. He lowered slowly back to the street, landing without force. The mask followed, landing lightly beside him, and patted his shoulder sympathetically. That gesture did more damage than any punch. Across the city, people watching from windows and screens felt the shift without being able to name it. This wasn't a clash of titans anymore. It was the quiet unraveling of the man who had defined what power looked like for decades. Homelander stepped back from the mask. Not in retreat. In confusion, he looked around at the broken streets, the dark buildings, the scattered debris that would take months to clear. All of it had happened while he was present, while he was fighting, while he was trying. And none of it had mattered. The mask, seeing no reaction worth engaging with, began wandering again, humming to himself as he walked out of the light and into the dark street beyond. Homelander didn't follow. He stayed where he was, staring at the empty chair the mask had set out for him earlier. For the first time, Homelander wasn't thinking about how to win. He was thinking about what it meant that he couldn't. By the time morning light crept over the skyline, Manhattan looked less like a battlefield and more like a place that had been rearranged by something that didn't understand permanence. Entire streets were folded, not destroyed in clean lines, but twisted into shapes that would take months to untangle. Buildings leaned at angles they were never designed to hold. Smoke still drifted from pockets no one dared approach. And in the middle of it, the mask was walking casually down an empty avenue like a man out for a morning stroll. He hummed to himself, hands behind his back, occasionally stopping to inspect damage as if admiring architecture. The grin never faded. The rhythm of his steps never changed. He didn't look like someone who had caused a catastrophe. He looked like someone sightseeing. From behind barricades far outside the city core, people watched through long lenses and phone screens. They had finally learned not to get close, not to film from windows, not to shout, but they were still watching. That was the mistake. The feeds had gone mostly quiet overnight, but recordings of the previous day had circled the globe 100 times over. News panels debated the nature of the mask nonstop. Social feeds were filled with analysis, edits, reaction videos, theories. The audience had multiplied even as the city emptied. The mask stopped in the street and looked up slowly, as if he could feel that distant attention pressing in from all directions. He smiled wider. In the command center, Stanley felt a wave of dread hit him before anything even happened. "He can feel it again," he whispered. Analysts didn't understand what he meant until the mask reached into thin air and pulled out something new. A giant film projector. He set it up in the middle of the road and pointed it at the side of a damaged building. The machine whirred to life, casting flickering light onto brick and broken windows. The footage it played was from earlier that day. Homelander punching him into the street. The anvil falling. The mirror held up to Homelander's face. The mask sat cross-legged in front of the projection and watched it like a child enjoying a favorite cartoon. He was replaying himself. Across the globe, people watching the live feed realized what they were seeing. The mask wasn't just reacting to attention. He was now interacting with the recordings of it. He had found a way to bring the audience into the city without them physically being there. Butcher saw the projection from a distance and swore under his breath. "He's looping it," he said. "He's feeding off the replay." Nodded grimly. "We never stopped watching." Homelander approached slowly from behind, watching the footage of himself being humiliated play on the side of a building in giant scale. He stood there, forced to watch it with the mask, unable to look away. The mask laughed silently at certain moments, slapping his knee in exaggerated amusement. Homelander didn't react. He just stared. Because this wasn't happening live anymore. This was the past, and he still couldn't change it. The projector flickered brighter. The mask adjusted a dial, and the image expanded across multiple buildings, turning an entire block into a looping display of yesterday's chaos. Anyone watching from miles away could see it glowing against the skyline. The event had become its own broadcast. In apartments far outside the city, people leaned toward windows to see the strange light in the distance. Phones came out again. Streams resumed. The audience was reforming. Stanley felt his hands shake. "He's figured out that memory is the same as presence," he said. And that was when the world understood too late what had actually happened. This was never about the mask reacting to the city. It was about the city, the cameras, the people, teaching the mask how their world worked. He had learned. The mask stood up and took a bow toward the projected footage of himself. Then he turned and looked directly at Homelander, who was still standing there, small in the glow of his own past failure. The mask patted him on the arm gently and walked away from the projection without a care. Behind him, the footage kept playing. And across the world, millions kept watching. Butcher lowered his binoculars slowly. "We didn't starve him," he said. "We trained him." Didn't answer. Because below them, the mask was no longer wandering aimlessly. He was walking with purpose again. He didn't need the city. He didn't need the audience nearby. He had learned how to carry the audience with him. And nothing they did now would take that knowledge away. Morning didn't bring relief. It brought clarity. Manhattan was still standing in pieces, but the event had already moved beyond geography. The mask walked through ruined streets without urgency, humming to himself while the giant projector behind him continued replaying the previous day's chaos across brick and glass. The footage glowed against the skyline like a second sunrise, visible for miles. People outside the city watched that glow instead of the news. They didn't realize they were still participating. The mask stopped at an intersection where the asphalt had split into jagged layers. He looked down at the cracks thoughtfully, then reached into thin air and pulled out a piece of white chalk. He began drawing lines on the street like a child sketching a game board. Squares, arrows, symbols that meant nothing to anyone watching. He stepped from one square to the next with exaggerated care, as if following rules only he understood. Every time he landed, a nearby object reacted. A streetlight fell. A window shattered. A parked car rolled slowly into an empty storefront. Not violently. Casually. The world was now responding to patterns he invented. From a distance, Butcher watched and felt the weight of final understanding settle into place. "He's not breaking things anymore," he said quietly. "He's rewriting how things behave around him." Nodded, and we showed him how. Because the mask had learned something fundamental from this world. Cause and effect. Not the way physics worked, but the way attention worked. Stanley stood in the command center, staring at the feed with hollow eyes. "He doesn't need chaos now," he whispered. "He knows how to make the world react in smaller ways." That was worse. The mask wasn't swinging buildings anymore. He wasn't dropping anvils. He was stepping lightly through the city, and reality bent subtly around him in response. Less spectacle, more influence. Homelander stood on a distant rooftop, watching without moving. He hadn't spoken in hours. The man who once defined strength now looked like a spectator in his own world. He watched the mask hop between chalk squares and understood something he couldn't fix. This wasn't a fight he had lost. This was a game he didn't know how to play. The projector in the distance kept looping. The footage of yesterday's destruction had become background noise for the city, a constant reminder that nothing had reset overnight. The broken buildings were still broken. The crushed vehicles still blocked streets. The dead were still dead. Nothing bounced back. The mask finished his chalk path and stepped off the final square. He looked around at the quiet devastation with satisfaction, then clapped his hands once. Across the city, dozens of small things happened at once. Doors swung open, windows cracked, loose signs fell, not from force but from coincidence aligning with his presence. It was as if the environment had started responding to him automatically without needing large gestures. Butcher felt a chill. "It's permanent," he said. The mask didn't have to try anymore. The world had adapted around him. Stanley realized the worst part wasn't the destruction behind them. It was the future ahead. Even if the mask disappeared now, the city had already learned the wrong lesson. People would keep watching, keep filming, keep reacting to the absurd because they had seen it once. Fear had stopped being the dominant force. Absurdity had replaced it. The mask looked up at the skyline one last time, then casually reached into thin air and pulled out the wooden mask itself. He held it in his hands thoughtfully, examining it from both sides like he had just remembered something important. He placed it gently on the hood of a wrecked car and stepped away. For a brief moment, the green suit flickered. Stanley Ipkiss stood where the mask had been, breathing hard, eyes wide, staring at the destruction like he had just woken from a nightmare he couldn't remember entering. He saw the broken streets, the leaning buildings, the silent city that would never be the same. He saw what had happened, and he began to cry. Behind him, the projector still played. The footage of the mask laughing at Homelander looped endlessly on the side of a building, visible from miles away. People still watched it from outside the city, still sharing, still reacting, still turning it into something entertaining. Stanley turned slowly toward the sound of that projection and felt something worse than horror. Understanding. He realized the mask hadn't left, because the world had already learned how to behave like him. Somewhere in another borough, a group of teenagers in cheap green masks were climbing on abandoned cars for social media videos. In another city entirely, someone dressed in a bright suit was jumping off a roof for attention, believing the world would bend the way it had on screen. The damage wasn't just physical. It was behavioral. Butcher watched Stanley from a distance and didn't move. He understood what the man was seeing. This wasn't something you could shoot, trap, or outsmart. The mask had done what no soup ever had. He had changed how people thought the world worked. Stanley picked up the wooden mask slowly, holding it like something radioactive. He looked at the city again, then at the object in his hands, realizing that the real breaking point had already passed. The world would never go back to running on fear alone. Because now everyone had seen what happened when something didn't obey it. And somewhere in the distance, another building groaned and shifted slightly as weakened supports finally gave way, collapsing into the street hours after the mask had walked past it. Not because he touched it, but because the world was still catching up to what he had already set in motion.